Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Pamela Thomas. You can call me Pam. This morning, Kat Anderberg will be presenting Metadata Basics, Dublin Core. She will answer questions at the end. Just a reminder that we are asking for suggestions for our FY 2027 Online with the CMC webinars, and our team is meeting next week. So if you have a hot topic you want us to cover, then you've got until next week to let us know. So you can either add that topic in the chat, or you can put it on the CMC evaluation form, which I'll add the link to the chat in a second. And then when Kat's ready for questions, you can either put your questions in the chat starting now until the end, or at the end you'll be able to unmute yourself. And the slides with the notes are in L2 if you would like to follow along or download those later. This is being recorded, and we will send out the link probably by early next month. All right, Kat, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am Kat Anderberg, the metadata cataloger here at the CMC, and today I'm going to be talking about Dublin Core. So, what is Dublin Core? Dublin Core is a general-purpose metadata vocabulary that can be used to describe resources of any type. While it was originally designed to describe digital resources, it is flexible enough to be used to describe physical resources as well. Dublin Core was named after Dublin, Ohio, where it was originally developed, and the Dublin Core is a set of 15 generic, widely used elements, though later updates include a couple of additional elements as well as the use of qualifiers. Dublin Core metadata is metadata that is designed for interoperability on the basis of semantic web or linked data principles. And each element has a URI that is managed by the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, or DCMI. Dublin Core is the most commonly used metadata vocabulary, and it uses terminology that is easily understood. It is easy to create and maintain, and it is extensible. Dublin Core was developed by OCLC and the National Center for Supercomputing Applications after a joint workshop to discuss metadata semantics for web-based resources held in Dublin, Ohio in March of 1995. The initial set of 15 elements was released in September 1998, and a couple years later, Qualified Dublin Core was introduced, which includes 3 additional elements as well as a set of qualifiers to several of the original elements, which allows a greater degree of specificity when describing resources. Currently, Dublin Core terms are expressed in RDF vocabularies for use in linked data, but non-RDF metadata creators continue to use Dublin Core terms in other contexts as well. In 2008, the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, DCMI, was incorporated as an independent entity responsible for maintaining the Dublin Core vocabulary. And in 2009, OCLC completed the transfer of DCMI-related assets and supporting activities to DCMI. Dublin Core was developed with minimal constraints. No elements are required, and each element can be repeated as necessary. This allows a great deal of flexibility and customization. While Dublin Core itself has minimal constraints, individual organizations can decide which, if any, individual elements are required for their own collections. For example, the Illinois State Library requires several elements for materials described in the Illinois Digital Archives, or IDA. We'll look more closely at how Dublin Core elements are used in IDA later on. The Dublin Core Metadata Initiative is an organization supporting innovation in metadata design and best practices across the metadata ecology. DCMI is a 501c3 nonprofit, and they are supported by a paid membership model. DCMI activities include work on architecture and modeling, discussions of collaborative work in DCMI communities and DCMI task groups, global conferences, meetings and workshops, and educational efforts to promote widespread acceptance of metadata standards and best practices. DCMI supports shared innovation in metadata design and best practices across a broad range of purposes and business models. DCMI manages long-term curation and development specifications, metadata term namespaces, runs an annual international conference, and creates training resources in metadata best practices, including tutorials, webinars, and workshops. Their principles of operation are open consensus building, international scope and participation, neutrality of purposes and business models, neutrality of technology, and cross-disciplinary focus. The 15 core elements are contributor, coverage, creator, date, description, format, identifier, language, publisher, relation, rights, source, subject, title, and type. Qualified Dublin Core added the use of qualifiers for certain elements to allow for greater specificity, and also added the elements audience, provenance, and rights holder. Later on, the elements instructional method, accrual periodicity, and accrual policy were also added. I will note here that while many people still refer to qualifiers in Dublin Core, the term qualifiers no longer appears on the DCMI website, and both simple and qualified elements are just referred to as DCMI terms or DC terms. Now, I'm going to take you through the current set of Dublin Core terms. Contributor is an entity responsible for making contributions to the resource. Coverage is the spatial or temporal topic of the resource, spatial applicability of the resource, or jurisdiction under which the resource is relevant. Spatial coverage is the spatial characteristics of the resource, and temporal coverage is the temporal characteristics of the resource. Creator is an entity responsible for making the resource. Date is a point or period of time associated with an event in the life cycle of the resource. Date available is the date that the resource became or will become available, such as the date that a research paper is available to view on the publisher's website. Date created is the date of the creation of the resource. Date accepted is the date of acceptance of the resource, such as the date a research paper was accepted for publication. Date copyrighted is the date of copyright of the resource. Date submitted is the date of submission of the resource, such as the date that a research paper was submitted to the journal for publication. Date issued is the date of formal issuance of the resource. Date modified is a date on which the resource was changed. And date valid is the date or date range that the resource is valid. Description is an account of the resource. The two official subproperties of description are abstract and table of contents. As we'll see when we look at examples, it's not uncommon to repeat the description field several times to provide different types of descriptive information about the resource. Format is the file format, physical medium, or dimensions of the resource. Extent is the size or duration of the resource, and medium is the material or physical carrier of the resource. Identifier is an unambiguous reference to the resource within a given context, and bibliographic citation is a bibliographic reference for the resource. Language is a language of the resource. Publisher is an entity responsible for making the resource available. Relation is a related resource. Relation has a lot of qualifiers and subproperties. Conforms to is an established standard to which the described resource conforms. Has format is a related resource that is substantially the same as the pre-existing described resource, but in another format, such as a digital copy of a video held on a VHS tape. Has part is a related resource that is included either physically or logically in the described resource. Has version is a related resource that is a version, addition, or adaptation of the described resource. Is format of is a pre-existing related resource that is substantially the same as the described resource, but in another format. This is an inverse property of has format. Is part of is a related resource in which the described resource is physically or logically included. Is referenced by is a related resource that references, cites, or otherwise points to the described resource. Is replaced by is a related resource that supplants, displaces, or supersedes the described resource. Is required by is a related resource that requires the described resource to support its function, delivery, or coherence. For example, if you had a lesson plan and a worksheet, both with their own record, the worksheet would be required by the lesson plan. Is version of is a related resource of which the described resource is a version, addition, or adaptation. This is an inverse property of has version. References is a related resource that is referenced, cited, or otherwise pointed to by the described resource. Replaces is a related resource that is supplanted, displaced, or superseded by the described resource. Requires is a related resource that is required by the described resource to support its function, delivery, or coherence. For example, bringing back the lesson plan and worksheet example, the lesson plan would require the worksheet. Rights is information about rights held in and over the resource. Access rights is information about who may access the resource or an indication of its security status, such as database materials that can only be viewed by students of a specific university or classified materials. License is a legal document giving official permission to do something with the resource. Rights holder is the person or organization who owns or manages rights over the resource. Source is a related resource from which the described resource is derived, and subject is a topic of the resource. Title is a name given to the resource, and alternative title is an alternative name for the resource. Type is the nature or genre of the resource. DCMI recommends using a controlled vocabulary for this element, and DCMI actually maintains a type vocabulary list that many organizations use for this element. The DCMI type vocabulary terms are collection, dataset, event, image, interactive resource, moving image, physical object, service, software, sound, still image, and text. Provenance is a statement of any changes in ownership and custody of the resource since its creation that are significant for its authenticity, integrity, and interpretation. Audience is a class of agents for whom the resource is intended or useful. Audience education level is a class of agents defined in terms of progression through an educational training context for which the described resource is intended. Mediator is an entity that mediates access to the resource. Accrual method is the method by which items are added to a collection. Accrual periodicity is the frequency with which items are added to a collection. And accrual policy is the policy governing the addition of items to a collection. Instructional method is a process used to engender knowledge, attitudes, and skills that the described resource is designed to support. While Dublin Core itself does not mandate that any specific elements be required, individual organizations can choose to require certain elements in their guidelines and best practices. Currently, all of my Dublin Core records are created in Content DM for collections in the Illinois Digital Archives, or IDA, and IDA has identified 15 elements that they require for metadata records, as well as another 9 that they recommend. Several metadata elements used in IDA records do not actually map to Dublin Core terms. Remember what I said earlier about Dublin Core being extensible. Dublin Core allows and even encourages organizations to supplement the Dublin Core with additional metadata elements from outside vocabularies. IDA's required elements are title, creator, subject, description, date original, format, rights management, type, geographic coverage, contributing institution, collection name, full text transcription for documents, audio, and video files, file size, and language. The 9 metadata elements that IDA recommends are time period, browse topic, which is a controlled vocabulary administered by IDA to facilitate browsing among collections, contributor, which is a required element for oral histories and is used to identify the interviewer, publisher, source, date digital, which refers to the date that the original material was digitized, digitization specifications, which refers to the process used to capture and create the digital derivative of the original material, digital format, and serial information. Several of these elements have controlled vocabularies managed by IDA, with the exception of the subject element, for which the recommended best practice is to select a value from a controlled vocabulary or formal classification scheme. It is recommended that subject words and phrases come from established thesauri or discipline-related word lists. In practice, many collections in IDA repeat the subject field in their records, using one instance of it for subject headings from LCSH or other vocabularies, and another instance for locally generated subject headings specific to that collection. Now I'm going to share some examples of Dublin Core records for different types of materials in IDA. Here is an example record from IDA of a photograph cataloged by the CMC for Marshall Public Library. This photograph is of a hand pump fire engine from 1868. The fields included in this record are title, creator, subject, which lists Library of Congress subject headings, genre headings, subject local, which lists locally created and maintained subject headings specific to this collection. In this case, the local subject headings are for residents of Marshall in or associated with the photograph, as well as geographic locations specific to Marshall. 3 description fields. We have description for a general description of the collection itself, content description for more detailed information about the photograph, and visual description for a visual description of the photograph. Date original, identifier, coverage, format, type, rights, file size, language contributors, and digital format. This example record of a video recording from IDA is a video recording of a master class from Ravinia Steen's Music Institute. The still captured here shows Brandon Garbo, Peter Aom, and Chae-Young Park playing Mendelssohn Piano Trio No. 2 in C minor, Opus 66. This video was not cataloged by the CMC. The fields included are title, subject Library of Congress, subject IDA, description creator, contributing institution, date original, coverage temporal, coverage geographic, type, format, file size, digital format, location, language, rights, original file name, identifier, and collection name. This example record from IDA is for an oral history that was cataloged by the CMC from Marshall Public Library. This is also an example of what Content DM calls a compound object, where one digital object contains multiple distinct files, oftentimes of different file types. This is different from a simple object, which is a digital object made of just one digital file. This oral history is from Ruth Ann Aniker, who was interviewed by the Friends of the Marshall Public Library as part of their oral history project to gather and preserve the history of the Marshall, Illinois area. This oral history record consists of the actual audio recording itself, in this case an MP4 file, the transcript of the oral history in both text and PDF formats, and several photographs of the subject of the oral history. And I have the thumbnails of each file in this object listed on the left-hand side of the slide. The fields used in this record are title, creator, subject, genre headings, description, date identifier, coverage, type, relation, which is somewhat confusing in this case, as in some collections, the word relation is used to represent temporal coverage. Rights, collection name, contributing institution, file size, language, contributors, and digital format. This example record from IDA is of a school newspaper cataloged by the CMC for Chatham Area Public Library. The Ball Chat was a bi-weekly student paper from the Ball Chatham School District from 1948 to 1959. The fields in this record are title, subject, again here using Library of Congress subject headings, subject local, in this case listing out the names of the newspaper staff, description, creator, date, type, format, identifier, language, geographic coverage, time period, contributing institution, collection name, rights, and transcript. This example record of Realia from IDA is a chainmail purse that was photographed by IHLS's Mobile Memory Lab and cataloged by the CMC. This is a decorative purse made of chainmail and painted with a floral pattern, and it was originally owned by the contributor's aunt. The fields in this record are title, Library of Congress subject headings, genre heading, local subject heading, description. As with the photograph record for Marshall Public Library I showed earlier, this description field is used for a description of the collection itself. Identifier, coverage, format, type, rights, collection name, contributing institution, file size, language, contributors, digital format, date digital, content description, and visual description. Before we wrap up for today, I just wanted to share a couple of metadata crosswalks with you. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but I wanted to give you a quick glimpse at how MARC fields and DC terms match up against one another. All three crosswalks on the next several slides will be linked in my resources. This here is an example of a MARC to simple Dublin Core crosswalk, which shows which MARC fields correspond to which simple Dublin Core terms. I'm not going to go through these fields line by line, but we can see that each DC term maps to several MARC fields. This crosswalk is pretty straightforward, but on the next few slides, I'll show you the MARC to qualified Dublin Core crosswalk, which gets a lot more granular. This is part of a MARC to qualified Dublin Core crosswalk, and it is a lot more detailed and granular than the MARC to simple Dublin Core crosswalk. Here we have some more fields and more fields and more fields. So as we can see, once the qualified Dublin Core terms come into play, the crosswalk gets significantly more complicated as more detailed information can be mapped to more specific terms. This is why qualified Dublin Core was developed. Compared to the MARC to simple Dublin Core crosswalk, where up to 10 or more MARC fields would map onto a single simple Dublin Core term, the use of qualified Dublin Core terms allows crosswalked metadata to retain a greater degree of its original specificity. Just as a visual example of the difference in the level of detail between simple Dublin Core and qualified Dublin Core, I have here the MARC to simple Dublin Core and MARC to qualified Dublin Core crosswalk sessions just for the Dublin Core term relation. On the left, we can see that MARC fields 530 and 670 or 530 and 760 through 787 all map to relation. But the crosswalk on the right is massive in comparison, and using the qualified terms preserves a lot more of the detail and specificity of the MARC record than just using the simple term. And then here is an example of a crosswalk going the other way from Dublin Core to MARC. This crosswalk shows both simple and qualified Dublin Core terms as they would crosswalk to MARC fields. And here's the second half of the Dublin Core to MARC crosswalk. Metadata crosswalks can seem really intimidating at first, but they really are useful tools if you need to transform records from one metadata vocabulary to another. And that's it for today's presentation. Here are links to the resources I used to create this presentation. And here are the IDA links to the example records I shared. On the call today alongside myself is Barb Scobie, Pam Thomas, Mary Cornell, Eric McKinney, Ryan Rafferty, Katie Roberts, and Andrea Giosta. And now we have time for any questions.
Hi, Kat. Thanks so much. We do not have any questions yet. I've also posted in the chat the link to the evaluation form. You are able to, hopefully, if I did it correctly, unable to unmute yourself and ask your question if you don't want to put it in the chat. And just a reminder, next month, we will be presenting Illinois and some St. Louis Blues. That's on May 14th at 10 a.m. So if you're interested in attending, please register in L2 for that. So does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Kat?
Hi, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So for the compound object example that you gave, where it had multiple files for the record, would you use the relation or like required by field for that at all?
No, because they are all in the same record. Let me
Okay.
navigate back to that slide quick. Oops. Okay. Um, so this is all one record, and the way that compound objects work in Content DM is that there's two levels of metadata. So the whole object has what's called object level metadata, and then each file is what's referred to as an item. And so it would have item level metadata for like the specifics of that one file.
Mhm.
But they are all combined together in one record. So the relation field would come into play when you had multiple records associated with each other, um, if if you had like a collection of essays that were all like published as one book, but for whatever reason you were putting them in, you were creating individual records for each essay, you could say that they were related to one another. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much for clarifying.
Of course.
Okay, any other questions? Again, you can post your question in chat or you can unmute yourself. And just a reminder, we are looking for suggestions for our next fiscal year, and we are meeting next week. So if you have a hot topic you want us to cover, either put it in chat or put it on the evaluation form when you fill it out.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is it better to have more information as opposed to less information I mean,
Yes, yes, yes.
yes, in your description, you want to be as thorough as possible. So never too much information, I guess.
Never too much information.
Okay.
Just like with creating any kind of catalog record in
Yep.
any format, more information is better. Um, you know, realities of the world and the profession being what they are, sometimes, you have to make judgment calls about like, do I spend 40 hours creating a perfect all-inclusive record, or do I like triage what's the most important information and do a 2-hour record and call it good? So,
Okay.
but
Thank you.
always
Yeah,
more is better.
Yep.
that's what I thought.
Especially for these digitized items, I think.
So to follow up on that, is it okay to, if you have a record and you don't know where it's come from? Can you put unknown, or do you put like a circa date, or things like that if you're really unsure of several of the components of Dublin Core?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the thing with Dublin Core is because no fields are required, if you don't know what something is, general best practice is to just not include that field
Mhm.
or to leave it blank instead of putting in unknown.
Okay.
Um,
Great.
a lot of a lot of organizations will develop their own internal standards and best practices as far as circa fields, how to word that, or circa dates as far as how to enter or word those. Um, but absolutely, I have a lot of photographs that I've cataloged that either don't have a date or have a circa date that I've um, generated myself based on, things like clothing photographed or car models. Um,
Okay. Comparative
and
things in the picture.
yeah,
Yeah.
comparative things that, from my own experience and knowledge that I can use to data photograph. But sometimes I'm just like, I cannot figure out, a decade that this might have been taken. So
Mhm.
you just leave it out.
Okay. That's
And
helpful.
I would say document what you're doing and try to be as consistent as possible with
Hmm.
all of your items and collections.
Yes. One of the resources linked in my resources slide is the IDA metadata standards
Hmm.
and best practices. So that's a great tool. And then if you're managing your own collection, you can pull on outside best practices, you can generate your own, but definitely keep everything documented,
Yes.
um, just so that way your records are consistent and you're not, sitting down to each record like, how am I doing this? And like figuring it out new again each time.
Well,
Okay.
and also good for people who are come after you,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
so that they know, what you were doing and maybe why as well.
And your
So
end
that always helps.
users that they
Yep.
can just like, they recognize what a record looks like and they're not surprised each time.
Yep. They know what to expect. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Any questions from today's presentation, or just we also take general cataloging questions? Oh, Brenda, you might have joined us later. I'm putting the evaluation form link in the chat again. Thanks. It's also linked to the L2 event if you ever want to find that. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, we hope to see you in May for our next presentation, Illinois and some St. Louis Blues. So that's May 14th. So thank you all for attending.